Welcome to another Good Eye podcast. I'm Jay Smack, and today my guest is Laurel Marr. Laurel is an end-of-life doula or death doula, doula meaning servant. She serves people going through that transition at the end of life towards whatever lies on the other side and their families. So let's get right into it. I'll let her describe it. My guest, Laurel Marr, end-of-life doula on today's Good Eye podcast. All right, and welcome to another Good Eye podcast. I'm Jay Smack, and my guest today is Laurel Marr. And Laurel, I'm going to let you get this thing rolling and describe, we'll get into your background and what led you to this, but you are an end-of-life doula. And I know that doula is a term often associated with childbirth more than end of life, but it really means servant. Can you start us off by giving us a little bit of background and what exactly it is that you provide, the services you provide? And thanks for being here.
Thank you for asking me. Yes, I am an end-of-life doula. Some people like to use the term death doula. I like the term death doula, actually, but for then some people it's hard to say the word death. We have come to a time, I think, in our lives where we're not certain what we think about death, and so end of life is softer, possibly. So anyway, that actually is one of the things that draws me into this role as a doula, is that we don't talk about death, and so fundamentally, probably the importance of coming to a time where we can talk about death is fundamentally what underlines my interest in this role. But so yes, a doula is traditionally there for birth. Death doulas, end of life doulas, I'm going to say is 10 to 12 years old. The idea, it was there is a physician, and he is in New Jersey, and he trained as a birthing doula to see what the role was, and then he transformed this idea into end-of-life work. And his training program is called INELDA, and I didn't train under that program. I trained with a hospice nurse who also saw the need for more service at end of life, in conjunction with hospice care. And so she started her own training program, Doula Givers, and that is where I trained. It was a remote training. It took me about 3 months to, do all of the lessons and do my homework, and I had some projects I had to submit. But that was the beginning of a whole new trajectory of life, which is being a servant to families and individuals that are facing end-of-life circumstances.
You said in there that this practice itself is, did you say 10 to 12 years old? That's all?
Well, for this American concept of being a death doula. I mean, when I've told people what I do, they're like, oh, like a death midwife. And I haven't done a lot of history reading on it, but I would think that death midwives have been with us since the beginning of time.
And that's why I asked. It seems like something that would be very closely associated with cultures such as Native American culture or Buddhist or really anything, but any group of people or culture or religion, if you will. I don't want to ascribe it to one or another, but who don't really see a solid line between the living and the non-living, but rather a transition of energy or consciousness or lack thereof. It obviously it's something that's been around a long time. But us being Westerners, we've got to ascribe all our regulations and criteria to it, I would imagine.
Yes, we do. And so it's a really interesting time for this new role to be emerging, because it's, we're coming from, years of outsourcing death to hospitals, and then once a death has occurred, to the funeral home. Like we can not see death at all anymore. I mean, it's kind of like you could go into a public restroom and not touch anything, right? You know, you don't have to flush the toilet. You don't, with it's automatic, the sink is automatic, the soap is automatic. We can go in and not touch anything. It's the same thing with death. We don't have to see it. And it really invites an important question is, what does this do to us as human beings if we don't see death? So hospice care, which has been around since the 70s, I believe, it was the initiation of bringing death back into the home, bringing death back to families. And I've even, spoke with my mom about this, and she remembers when she was a kid, her grandmother, it was a parlor in their home, and every funeral was held in that parlor. I mean, that was not long ago. And if my great grandmother would sleep in the parlor next to the casket. So we're not that far removed from having death at home. So the doula movement is an initiative, following this hospice initiative of bringing death back home, is to help families care for the dying, teach them to care for the dying. It's an art we've lost, and the idea behind it is bringing it back. In many ways, probably might save us. So, what I mean by that is, if we can be a part of the dying process, we can begin to kind of recover something greater than us, and we can maybe even be a part of death in a way that we will grieve. We'll always grieve with loss, but our grieving could be different. It could be better. It could be more whole if we're part of an end of life process versus just not seeing it.
I'm going to jump around a little bit as you bring things up so that I don't lose them or go too far off track. But you mentioned hospice several times. What's the difference between the services you provide and hospital? And I get that some of it might be administrative, when it comes to hospitals or insurance, something that stark. But in your mind, where's that line? What's the difference?
Well, that's a great question. So one of the reasons doulas are becoming popular is that with hospice, there's going to be there's regulation, and that means limits on hours and service. And I don't, and by service I mean, I'm thinking more in hours. A family's needs will be met by hospice with the social worker, the chaplain, volunteers, the nurse, and the doctor that are on the case. All the needs will be met. There's someone who comes, in and can help daily with, toileting and some of the activities of daily living. But where needs aren't being met because of regulation is just families need more. They need more. They need more hands in the mix. Death is a really big deal, and death needs. There's so many, because we don't know how to care for the dying anymore, that we become overwhelmed. And so if there's someone like a doula who can kind of be a guide, for a lack of a better word. And I don't mean that as solely in a spiritual sense. I mean it in a very administrative sense. There's a lot of tasks that need to be taken up when someone's heading towards end of life. You need to make sure that their affairs are in order, that, is there anyone estranged in the family or in the, from the community that should come be with that patient before they die, if it's not going to cause a problem, of course. Is there, what type of death vigil does this person want? Do they want to have everyone around them? Do they want to have candles? Do they, they want to have, hymns sung, or, specific readings that they like? We can choose, elements that, make us, maybe more comfortable with death. There's an advanced directive that is becoming popular called the 5 wishes, and it's much more subjective than just the state form or something that you would have your attorney draw up. And so looking at the subjective nature of death is becoming more popular, and doulas are a wonderful resource for the creativity that can go along with end-of-life planning. And so that is an area that is wide open for wide open for conversation, wide open for actually digging in and looking at our life and looking at the whole life and thinking about our stories and what is it that makes us afraid of death. And is there is there a way to foster communities such that we're all in this together. We're not alone in death. I think that's one of the things that's really scary, is that, how is death going to be? I'm alone, but like when I go out into communities and talk about my work, I said, like, one of the main things I can bring to this, this new conversation around death is that I can look into our communities and say that everybody is important. It takes a village for one family. If say there's a patient who has cancer and they have decided not to take aggressive treatment, or if they did aggressive treatment and it didn't work and the doctor has prescribed hospice care, a lot has to be taken care of if a patient's going to be at home. And some of those things might be like, a handyman might need to come in from the neighborhood and help with a little makeshift bedroom, right? And what about the lawyer that had done the will, or like, does the life insurance agent need to be called? Like, there's a lot of orchestrating that needs to happen. And so a doula can help with that. A doula can help families decide, as this person gets closer and closer to death, like, who is going to be the designated person to do specific things? Who's going to call family? Who's going to, maybe the doula will call the funeral home. The doula can educate a family that, when the patient dies, the funeral home doesn't need to be called immediately. A dead body can be at home for a specified amount of time. And so educating families that they actually have a lot of agency is really important. And so that should be a big part of the conversation. And then past that, a doula can help a family with all sorts of memorial planning, funeral planning. If things are planned in advance, you can do a lot more than if you haven't done any planning. So you could keep the body home for a couple of days and, but things need to be arranged. That the funeral home is coming, the body has been pronounced dead. You could have a service at home with the body laid out on a table. It's been washed by the family members. It's been dressed. There are flowers around the body. We have a lot more agency in death than we allow ourselves. Even embalming is not a requirement. It is for specific things. Like if you want to have a public viewing in a funeral home, it's a requirement. But if you don't want to do that, you don't have to. You can have a green burial. Like we may not be educated on those things, in part because we don't want to talk about it and we don't want to think about it. And so a doula is going to be a wonderful resource for families to educate them and go along the journey with them.
Yeah. And you mentioned a couple times our quote unquote problem with death. Of course, it's scary. We don't want to think that our existence, what we come to recognize, our daily consciousness as we identify as our life, not including the death or not including the transition or the change in form of the energy that we inhabit or put forth. In your experience, do you find that the process is harder, say, traumatic or sadder for the family versus the individual, or vice versa? Do you see that? Is that a scenario that you recognize that it's harder on, say,
Great question.
the family than it is the actual person who's facing that transition?
It's a mix. It kind of depends on the age of the dying person. If a person has had a full life, if I'm thinking in particular in two families where it was just old age, they were both in hospice care at home, went according to plan. Death, became a blessing at the end, right? Not a blessing in a sense that the person was gone, but that person had a full life. They had a good death. What more can you ask for? There's, of course, loss and grief that comes with loss and sadness. But it's different than when a younger person gets sick, and death cuts life short, or if there's children in the mix, or widowed spouses that are young, so in those cases, it just, in every case is so, even with that, is so different. It just depends. I worked for a family that the mother was in her 40s and there was an 8-year-old child left, and I was incredibly difficult for the mother. I think what I witnessed is it was harder for the mother than the family. Her grief at not being able to see her daughter, that was kind of primarily the work we did that last bit of time for her, was just encouraging her to let go. She had a very strong faith, and that helped her. I don't think the daughter understood. She was too young. I did see the daughter a couple times immediately after the death, with planning the funeral and at the funeral. Then I saw her a couple months later, and there still seemed to be, like, I'm not sure the daughter still fully understood. Like, her life, this daughter, I think she's probably 10 or 11 by now, but the fact that she doesn't have her mother, well, she'll carry that with her for the rest of her life. Her life journey, in part, will be about healing from that. And so, that's part of her story. And then I'm thinking of another person who died, not young, not old, in his 60s. And his journey was interesting. He was sick very quickly and only lived a couple months. But there was at first, and he was single, so he didn't have a real family, and he had a lot of friends, but a real family he was leaving behind. So there wasn't the attachments so much. But personally, he just struggled with the fact that he wasn't going to go back to work. That was really hard to let go of. He was a brilliant businessman, and that was really, really difficult. Probably what he cherished the most. But by the time I saw him a couple of days before he died, he was totally at peace, and was actually, I'm not sure he really knew how much time he had left, but he was really at peace, and yeah.
You make good points when you say that all situations are different, because I had sort of, even though I've experienced situations that were not, the word I was going to use is romanticized, in that, before we spoke, I picture you coming in, everyone knows in 6 months, grandma might move on at that point, and it's so not that. And I, honestly, I had sort of thought about more of what you might think when you think of Native American respect for passing away or transitioning, if you will, into the spirit realm. That said, are you ever brought in after the fact? Someone has already passed away. Is that more a function of, say, a grief counselor, or even accountants, for lack of a better description? But you get where I'm going. You ever brought in after the person has already passed away to help the family?
I am. Yeah, that's actually how I got started in this work, is that I was working in a church, and we had a lot of funerals. And so I always got started with the family, either a couple days before death, because death was imminent and the family was going ahead and speaking with the pastor and making some, burial plans. And so I was brought in at that time, or a death had occurred, maybe unexpected, and brought in, and worked. And so that's actually what made me realize I liked this area of work. And so thought, well, how can I expand upon it and get started earlier? But even since I've become a trained doula, yes, I have had some cases where I came in after the death, and it's never too late to hire a doula. I'll tell you that, because there's a lot we can do with grief work, and so, but one specific example I can give you is I worked. So at this church, there was a parishioner who had made some suicidal comments, and we were aware, checking in on him. The family knew this as well, and had actually, there was a short period of time where the person who did commit suicide didn't communicate with the family, and so the family was calling the church, and it's like, what is going on? We haven't heard from him. So it was, it was definitely, there was, it wasn't a huge surprise, and everybody had done, what they thought best to do with the situation, and then he did choose to take his life, and the family came, and we did the funeral, and it was very difficult. There was a lot of tension between the family, for the family, believing that the church could have done more, and so it caused a lot of tension, and I led, I was the pastor and the family, were having, because of this tension, I was brought in mainly because the one of the family members, I don't know, I just, for some reason, we could connect and we could get along, and so I helped her with with a lot of the planning aspect, and it took a lot of burden off of the pastor, and so we stayed in touch for a little while, wrapping all the things up that we needed to do for her, and the service. And then when I had done my training, I was building my website, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to reach out to her and see if she would mind writing a testimonial on my website, because that was a pretty special case. It was very difficult, and I think I served her well, and so I called her, and 3 years after the suicide, and she said, I will write a testimonial for you if you'll talk with me about my brother, and if you could help me through my grief, because I'm still grieving. And I said, oh my goodness. She goes, you knew him. She said, you're one of the few people I know that knew him. So you could see that 3 years later, I could still be of service to her. And so she did. She wrote a wonderful testimonial, and she actually even asked me to help her with some estate work, and I did. And so and a lot of it, it's not that she couldn't get the estate work done by herself. It was that the grief was still so intense. And I see this a lot with families. After death, there's so much to do. And my dad died this spring, and so I've been helping my mother with the tasks that remain, after someone dies and you receive the death certificate, their name is on everything, and you have to send the death certificate to the banks, and remove their name, and just, it is so painful. It's so painful that to even muster up enough energy to do it, and do it alone, it's near impossible. So I've seen, in the case with that woman and with my mother, just having the presence of another person who's compassionate around the issue of death brings a lot to the table, and can help. And so it's never too late to hire somebody.
What do you do for yourself to take care of yourself in a line of work where you are faced with so much death and sadness, and not your own? Because we tend to feel a little bit helpless, which is why we fear death. That's nothing we can change. It's inevitable. We will all experience it. Maybe that's a poor choice of words, but you get where I'm going. How do you take care of yourself, just from a daily standpoint, and to not, let it infiltrate other parts of your life? How do you take care of yourself?
That's a great question. Talking about it is a huge way, like talking about the experience, and remembering the stories of people I've helped, unloads a lot of sadness, and I have, like, even like one family I worked for. It's I think 2 weeks was all I worked for them, because I kind of got called in at the last minute, but I had 10 days of those 2 weeks with the dying patient, and I really came to like love her and think, if I had met you earlier, we would have been friends. So even within just such a short period of time, it was like I already had lost a friend. And so, sadness does go along with the job. But part of it is you realize this is your work and you're called to it, So to be called to be a servant in death, like, it's going to just come with that, it's going to, and so in that specific case, because it was so short, I worked a lot. Like, I couldn't have kept that pace up for months, right? It was intense. And I didn't have a lot of time to take care of myself. I was like, oh my God, I got to get up and I got to get to the hospital. And then I was there all day, and then I got home and I had to take care of my kids and go to bed and get up and do it again. And so, it was frantic pace. And, but that was, at the same time, she wasn't getting an extra day just because I wanted a day off, right? So after that, sometimes you can't change the pace, you just have to go with it. And that's how it's going to be for the caregivers too, right? So, a lot of my work it's not replacing a caregiver. It's maybe offering respite for the caregiver, or, just maybe I'm not even with the patient for a bit, but I'm with the family. So, you definitely have to be aware. You got to be really self-aware, and you need to know when you're breaking, because that's not going to help anybody. And if you need to take a little bit of time off in between, clients, or adjust your work a little bit where you're really working with, people who are well, and you just want to help them get their advanced directives done. Like, there's other areas you can take a break into and still stay in the industry. But like when my dad died, for instance, I was working with a family, and I had to say to them, I need a couple, like, they weren't, someone was not dying. But I was working with a family on some, like, more placing their mother in a assisted living facility and doing some family mediation, referring them to a lawyer. So it was just end of life related things. And then my dad died. And when I called them and told them, one of them said, oh, well, let me tell you about my dad's death. And like, that's totally normal. And that's what we want, because we're bringing the conversation of death back into the room, right? So that person should have been able to tell me about their father's death, because there's probably a lot of processing that person still needs to do, especially in the face of the fact that they're helping their mother get into assisted living because their father's no longer there. But at the moment, I couldn't hear it. It was too raw for me to think of my father's death. And so I had to excuse myself from it. So we just need to, be smart about it. And it's not that I could never listen to that person's story, but I had to say, you know what, I can't hear it today. I would love to hear it, and maybe in a couple of weeks. So we have to have, an awareness, and then all the other things that, we should just have as human beings, like get out and get some exercise, and, and take care of ourselves like we would with any other job.
Your website mentions that you spent some time out west, and you learned a lot about holistic care, you said, during your time in Colorado. How does holistic care play into what you do for people or their families?
It's funny because, like, when I was out west, I wish I had been like a naturopath physician. But I was like, there's no medical schools here. I don't even have the prereqs. I was a business major. I'm in my 30s. When I was growing up, I wanted to be a nurse, and my father was a physician, and I wanted to follow in the footsteps of and work in medicine, and life just took me in different directions. And so here, in my 40s, I've come around and I'm a doula, and that combines this kind of like desire to be a nurse and a desire to be a naturopath physician, like bringing them together. But and this kind of goes back to something you asked earlier about how are you different than hospice. But doulas don't do any medical care. So, I couldn't even administer morphine. I can remind the family to administer the morphine and encourage them to keep a log so they know, they're staying ahead of schedule and not, going to get behind they're going to stay ahead of the pain. I can help her remind them, on caring for the patient in that way. But like, I couldn't even put a Band-Aid on in case I'm covering up a new bed sore. Like, that is for the hospice team to see. And I could, maybe notice it if I was, helping the family. Be like, you know what, I didn't notice that last week when I was here. You should definitely tell the hospice nurse, or if I ran into the hospice nurse, mention it. So there's areas you can help in, but directly we're not doing any medical care. But you can see that, the desire of, this kind of like, I really got into natural medicine being out west, and holistic care. It's kind of come forward in such that, helping families holistically is that, we're accepting death. I mean, that's the umbrella over the whole thing, is that, okay, death is happening. One of the things I've noticed that families get a little tense when I come around more, because coming around more means death is getting closer. And so, but holistically, a doula will help a family accept and embrace death and await its arrival, which is really a kind of like waiting for birth in a strange way. And I'm thinking of this one patient that was my age, and I think that's why it was memorable for me, is because I thought, well, what if this was me in the bed, instead of me standing here next to her, encouraging her. And I kind of, at the moment, like being a mother and have had children, and this woman having had children, I felt this kind of special connection to her, that like, wow, we were kind of like, we were doing this in childbirth, in the bed, unable to get out, waiting for the moment, and so in that sense, death is kind of like birth. And and spiritually speaking, I think for many religions, I mean, I'm a Christian, and I kind of think of death as rebirth, on many, and I think that most religions likely think of death as not the end necessarily, but the beginning of something new, or the continuance of something.
Yeah, that theme's pretty common in cultures and religions around the world. Tibetan Buddhists think that, you're instantly reincarnated. And depending on the life you just lived or spent, you go back based on how you spent that life. And if you need a lot more practice, maybe you go back as a squirrel and work your way back to a human.
Exactly. But exactly. And I've talked with families, and of all different faiths, and so it's when we're trained as doulas, we're not we're not supposed to impose our beliefs on others. And if a family is interested in our beliefs, or I particularly have been hired for my beliefs, because that's what the family wanted, then that's a different story. But still, even if I was hired because I share the same faith, there's boundaries, I have to read the room. I have to know, what is this family really wanting from me? But I can say that whether we share the same faith or not, as our families we're serving, doula work is irreplaceable, and a lot will come from it. Mm-hmm.
And speaking of boundaries, and you mentioned some of the medical considerations, what you can and can't do, even the level of involvement. Are you in, I imagine you would be, but I'm not sure. Now I'm picturing a hospital room, which is not fair, but it's an image that pops to mind when you think of the potential of death. Are you in the same space as, say, medical personnel? And if so, I imagine you are, but you can tell me, what is the reaction to your service and the reaction from the medical community?
That's a great question. Yes, actually, I so even though hospice care is designed for death at home, a lot of people in hospice end up dying in the hospital. Very common. That's a different conversation. Could a doula prevent that? A doula could educate a family on how to prevent it. Yes, and in not every case. I mean, my aunt died in a hospice hospital because she didn't really want to die at home, right? So every situation is different. And what a doula cannot do is go in and create a perfect situation, right? Too many personalities involved, and the agency really comes down to the dying person. But that being said, and now I kind of lost the question. I'm sorry.
Oh no, yeah, the reaction from the medical community to
yes,
your presence.
Yes. So I'm thinking of 2 deaths that were in the hospital. The doctors actually thought it was pretty cool. They'd never heard of the role, and that is very true. Hospice is cognizant of the role, and in hospice, there's a hospice here where I am that's actually starting a volunteer doula program. So, but the doctors, they were like, oh, cool. Where I'm finding a sticking point though is that, who will refer me? That's been the hardest, is that like, could I go take my card up to that oncology ward and say, hey, if you see families that need extra care, would you give them my card? And I'll see if I could help this family. I haven't we're not there yet. We're not there yet.
Does it smack of opportunism, or it's just not tasteful? What are your thoughts?
I think the biggest risk right now is people are concerned about liability and privacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so when I was doing my training, and I, had my homework, and some of that homework was getting in actual bedside hours, I went to a nursing home in my neighborhood and was like, hey, I'm training. This is what I'm doing. I need hours. And I was like, do you know of any families? And they were so hung up on the privacy issue. And so they were like, no, we can't introduce you to any families. And so then I went around the neighborhood and put flyers up, and thought, well, maybe some families that have their loved ones in the nursing home will see. So it is hard. And I spoke to an assisted living facility that I've helped, that I got to know through another family I was serving, and one of the directors there was like, I've never heard of a doula. This is great, And so I said to her, well, would you have any hangups with referring families to me? And I said, with liability reasons? And she said, no. She said, I can give a business card, and it's up to the family to hire you, as long as there's no contract between the assisted living facility and the family with you involved. This is strictly between you and the family. So I hope we can get there with more people, because really the power comes from referrals.
Yeah, I can imagine. And there's no more powerful testimonial, if you will, than someone who says, this person really helped with the most difficult time in my life that I've ever experienced.
Exactly. And I can tell you, just a new layer of relationship forms. When I was working in the church, there was a family this was in New York City. They were not living in New York City, but the mother who was dying lived in the city, and the whole family had kind of been out of church for some years. And so they were like, well, we know she wants a Christian burial, and we want that, but we're not connected here in New York, and she's not connected. And so they remembered that her husband, who had died years before, had been on the vestry of the church where I worked some decades ago. And so they came to my church and said, Mr. So-and-so was a member of the vestry, and we don't have a church community here. Can we have a funeral? And the church was like, sure. And so, being in the position I was in that church, I was put in charge of the administrative task and the logistics. I'm not ordained, so I didn't do the funeral. I was just the point person. And I developed such a wonderful relationship with that family. They said, well, if you ever come to DC where they lived, give us a call. And I was like, I'm coming in 2 weeks. I was like, I actually am going to a conference. And they said, will you stay with us? And I did. I
Nice.
stayed with them. And the wife of that family told me later, she just said, that you were in the role you were around my mother's death. She said, that's like an automatic friendship.
So many people in that situation, and I've been in it myself. And I think that is a huge source of the grief and pre-mourning, if you will, mourning with an O, I mean with a U. You just don't know where to turn. And for most people, it's something they've never been through. They're forced into this situation because, as we said, it happens to everyone. There's no reversing it, and they just don't know where to turn. And with someone like you there, at least they have that expert, if you will, to lean on, which can be so reassuring.
It's really reassuring. And 2 thoughts are coming to mind. One is that a doula can take the reins, like it's not that I'm in control. I give agency to the family. I just carry out the tasks that are heavy, right? And that enables a family, that enables a wife to sit at the deathbed. She's not over there trying to figure out, all these specific details, right? I can do the heavy lifting while she sits and is a wife, right? And so same, with anybody in the family, they can be in their role. It's irreplaceable because they've got someone they trust who's got their back and is doing these things that, have to be done. The other thing I think that's really important is doulas going out in their communities and educating people on the importance of thinking about end of life prior to end of life, because that's when the best decisions can be made, because we're not so afraid. And there's this movement budding called Death Positive. And the movement is very practical, very noble. It's, let's talk about death. Let's talk about the fact that we don't want to talk about it. Let's talk about how we could have a good death, and how, if we kind of think about it a little bit, maybe get organized, put it aside, we can get back to living, which is the whole point. So this is why a lot of people are like, I hate the name death doula. They're like, why don't you call it like giving life doula or something like that? Doulas aren't just focused on death. That looks like that's what I'm focused on, but what is the purpose of it? So we can live, right? And so we can live without fear. We can have help in our bereavement. So if we talk about death and we acknowledge that we'll die, we can make some decisions such that, perhaps if, my death, my disease is such that, I'm going to be terminal, I'm going to accept it. I'm going to do work now to accept it. And then that acceptance is such that when that time comes, instead of aggressive treatment that has a low positive outcome, I'm going to choose to actually have quality of life at end of life. And so when that decision is made and hospice care is brought in, the quality of life at end of life is going to be a lot higher. And that is going to, in turn, be better for everybody, the dying person and the family that survives that dying person. The bereavement, the period of bereavement, it will still be there and it will still be intense, but it can mitigate some of the things that contribute to complicated grief, where some people never get their lives back. And one of those things is guilt. I know someone who feels really guilty about the treatment that they kind of encourage their spouse to take. Why? Because they didn't want their spouse to die. Of course, right? There's nothing to feel guilty about. Like this person, there's no need for guilt. But this is what our human minds do to us. That person died anyway. And so that person's gone, but the person who's left behind is grieving. Another thing I see, and this is really painful, is that planning not done in a good, like before the end, sometimes doesn't get done. Not because there's not time, but because the dying person can't do it. It's too painful. It is too painful to list out your items and who you're leaving it to when you're about to die. It's just too hard. And that person who dies, they're going to escape the grief and the hard work. But the family that's left behind has a lot to deal with. So some advanced planning, subject to change. Everyone's life changed. But the acknowledgement that we will die and that there are steps we can take that can actually help us and help those who are left behind can really change our course.
That's a really great point about the person actually facing death, escaping, because those details, if you will, after a person has passed away can break families apart, whether it's about inheritance or if the person doesn't have anything to inherit, what their final wishes were, where they wanted to be buried, what the service would be. And that is just tragic because it's so unavoidable, which kind of takes me back to what you were saying about what it's called, what your services are called. And that sort of puts us in a vicious circle if people don't want to call it a death doula because they're still avoiding the inevitable, which is our time will come. Let's call it something else so that we don't have to think about it. And maybe that's just me. I'm a big fan of the Stoics, so sometimes I tend to, look things in the face. But feel free to share any thoughts on that.
A couple of things come to mind is, you're totally right. And like another thing that will tear families, well, money always tears families apart. It does. And it's so painful. But if I'm going to say mom, for instance, decides, I want, okay, so this is a great thing a doula can do prior to any end of life diagnoses. Say, what, like someone my age could say, I don't think my mom has done any of her life planning. I have a big family. I think we need to talk about this, right? Dad died. And this is hypothetical, but anyway, so dad died. It was rough. Let's make sure we do it better with mom, right? So you could call your siblings together. I could say, hey, there's this great advanced directive called 5 Wishes. And we could sit as a family and we could let mom choose what care she wants. She can choose one of us, maybe the oldest, to be her healthcare agent, proxy, sometimes people call it, healthcare power of attorney. That when mom can no longer say, this is the care I want, that sibling will step in and say it, okay? That is going to eliminate a lot of issues, right? And we want to do that while we're well, because accidents happen. There was a case where a wife was on life support and the husband and the wife's family couldn't agree. I think 7 years it was in court. And I'm sure it bankrupted everybody. Eventually the husband won and they took her off life support, but it was an ethical issue of religion. And so these things can be avoided. Okay. But the likelihood of us getting into the conversations is low, right? So, a group of siblings could say, hey, we really should get a mediator. This is a mediator, and so the role, the dual role can morph into a mediator. And then, especially if you stay in your community for years as you grow your business, it's like, hey, remember that doula we asked 8 years ago? Let's have her come in because mom is on hospice care, right? And so you should keep up with your families and check in on them, and especially be like, hey, we made that advanced directive for your mom. Is she still living on her own? Did you need any help getting into an assisted living facility, doing some tours? Like, I know that assisted living communities in this neighborhood, so a doula can be much wider than death. And so, help families, especially now with baby boomers becoming, someone told me the day, 10,000 people a day turn 65. So if the doula movement grows over the next 15 years, we got a bunch of people out there like, I help families that are, and hopefully our deaths are going to be primarily bless deaths because someone lived a full life, right? And a doula can come in and like nurture that family, make sure everyone has the support they need. So often we don't live in the same cities as our parents anymore. Or maybe we do, but we're getting our PhD, and it's like when a diagnosis comes, can we just stop everything? Like these are big questions.
Some good points in there. And I want to be respectful of your time and start to draw this to a close. But I wanted to ask, you mentioned some of the arrangements after death, whether it's in the courts or financial, not just along those lines, but a possible death scenario based on whatever aspects might be contributing to that. Are there any situations that you try to avoid, or that you would say, this is not for me, I'm not the kind of services you need, whether it's say legal or administrative or medical?
Great question. And it was something I was thinking of that I'll add in there at the end. So, and you said earlier, boundaries. A doula has to have boundaries because you can be overused. You can be right. So a doula needs to know, where do I stop? Is there a better person for you? Like I got a call from somebody said, I am depressed and I want to stop eating and drinking and die. Would you help me? And I said, I can't, so boundaries, right? So that's a before death thing. But a doula has agency himself to go in and like meet with the family, check the scenario and say, this is good or bad for me, right? Like I would not take on a client that I thought, A, I couldn't serve because that defeats the whole purpose, or B, maybe there's something here that I'm not going to be able to serve because it brings something up in me, right? So, but also then to get into something larger, like I'm not a lawyer, I have ideas, but like of what, they need to do this, this, and this. But you know what? Like, that's why when I network in my community, who is the best, state attorney? Because I want to have a list so I know I'm sending my families to good attorneys, but also I want that attorney to say, you know what, that's a great doula. So we all work together as a community, but and I can say that, a lot of people want to take shortcuts and say, well, maybe the doula could, help us like on LegalZoom or something. But like one of my state attorney friends was like, oh, we call that legal doom, So
oh my God. Yeah.
Right. So a doula needs to be smart and wise. Like we are helping families. We are not trying to bring any more burden on. So to open that up a little bit wider, is a doula is private pay. And so it's an extra expense. And so as I'm telling you all these wonderful things a doula can do, the question I get asked a lot is like, isn't that for privileged people? Right. And so isn't that for people who can afford it? Now that's a big discussion in doula communities, and everybody's kind of doing their own thing, which is, some people are, like sliding scale. Some people are saying, I'll, not have a sliding scale, and the people that can afford me, I'll build a scholarship fund for people who can't, right? So there's a lot of different ideas going out there, because I think in part it's a deterrent. It's one more expense when I already have all these other expenses. But that being said, a doula will save you money in the long run. And by that, I mean educating you on the fact that you don't have to pay $1,000 for embalming unless you really want it, or that you want the full wake and that's required, but be educated on it. And the funeral industry has had to pass these there's protocols. They had, like, it used to be like, well, this is what it costs, and you didn't know the individual prices on things, but now they have to hand you a sheet that says every individual cost, and so it's a lot more transparent than it used to be. But even with like with referrals, like, that you're going to save a lot more money up front if you hire the lawyer and do it right than if you don't ever do it. And so a doula can point you in the right direction. Even dying at home is going to be more cost effective than going to the hospital.
Interesting. And all those things are things people may not even think of. It's just not something that's spoken about.
And exactly. And so I think that the best thing to do for now because there's no financing structures for doulas, we don't want to become regulated, because then we have the same problem that hospice has, which is limits. And so my thinking is that if we can go in and educate families on what a doula is, and they say, well, I'm definitely going to want one of those, put money away for it. Leave that in your end of life planning. Like, I'm going to want this. I want this for my family. I want it for myself. I'm going to put, a couple $100 away each year for it. Like, it's a great way to plan for it.
Jumping back just a second, and I'm about to wrap this up. I said that before, but there's so many questions, so maybe you'll come back at some point. And if I get a bunch of questions as a result of the episode, I'll have you back to answer some of them. But is there any sort of oath? Hippocratic oath type of thing for doulas?
Oh, great question. Not exactly. I think it's assume we do this work out of the bottom of our hearts. Because I'll tell you, like death can be dirty. Death can be like, you can want to, you can't walk away. You can't. When someone's dying, I mean, you're in it, right? So it takes a really special personality to stick with it. But so there's no governing boards over doulas. Like, most people probably wouldn't even know if they hired me who trained me, right? So it's not established like that. But there are some leading people in this doula movement who have come together and formed something called NEDA. And NEDA, and it stands for National End of Life Doula Association, I think. And I became a member and took like a test, which kind of like, they call it micro credentialing. So it's doulas coming in from all these different training programs, then kind of form under an arch that's like, there's consistency. Right. And it's ethical. It has all these different points. And one of them is like ethics, And so we are then kind of like, okay, well, maybe eventually doulas will be well known enough that people will say, oh, you don't want a doula who's not been, credentialed by NEDA, because that she's going to come with she's going to come with standards. So that's kind of the biggest regulation there is right now. And NEDA continues to educate us. I get webinar prompts all the time. I could dive in and continue my education through them. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, we could go on forever, so maybe you'll come back at some point. I'm sure I'll.
Yeah. I want to end on this.
Yeah, please do.
Like, kind of coming back to saying, plan for your doula while you're well and put your money away. 10 years from now, I think, especially as, why is the doula movement so important right now is because we have our largest generation is coming towards closer to end of life ages, right? And so we're seeing the limits within the care structures we already have in place. And so we're suffering. We don't have enough care. It's caregiving crisis, elder care crisis. So as these converge, a lot of people believe the answer is doulas. They are going to come in, and I see it from so many standpoints of how it could change our nation if we all ended up coming and like caring for each other, right? And so I think in 10 years, it will like be like, well, you don't have a doula? Like, you've got to have a doula, right?
Like these
days.
Hope
it's an expected norm.
Like an accountant. You do your own taxes? You do your own death? What are you, crazy?
Exactly.
Well, maybe we'll get there.
I hope so.
Well, we could all use with some honest, productive conversations. So you never know. Maybe one day we'll have them again.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Oh, Laurel Marr, thank you so much for being here. I want to say to everybody, your website is LM Doula Care. That's DOULA care.com. LM Doula Care, where there's a bunch of information there, and people can contact you there. And like I said,
and remote, like I will work remotely. It's not as
Yeah.
good as being able to be in person, but for some of the maybe family mediation, getting end of life plans in place, remote work is fine.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, you've answered a lot of questions already today. I can't imagine when people actually get into the weeds, as it were, with you, and just the amount of information that you can help them access. So thanks for your time and your care, and for what you're doing even if nothing else, it's fostering responsible conversation, which I think is something that could save the world if we were all intellectually honest with each other. So you never know, though.
Yep.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Laurel. Thanks very much to Laurel for taking time. And like I said in the episode, we could have gone on and on and on and on. So if you have questions, please do email me, j@jsmack.com or goodeyepodcast@gmail.com. Either one is fine. j@jsmack.com is probably easier to remember. If you have questions for her, please do submit them, and I would love to have her back on to answer some of those questions directly. There are far too many questions for me to ask in one sitting, so if you do have those questions, hit me up, and I'd love to relay them to Laurel. You can find out more at goodeyepodcast.com or at my website, jsmack.com. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening today. Thank you for your time, attention, and intention. And I'll see you back here real soon on another Good Eye Podcast.